June 1835. Edenton, North Carolina. Harriet Jacobs stood in her grandmother's kitchen and made a decision that defied every instinct a mother possesses. She was about to disappear, not to freedom, but into a darkness so complete that her own children wouldn't know she was watching them grow up. Dr. James Norcom believed he owned her future. For years he'd cornered her with threats disguised as promises, his breath hot against her ear while his wife slept 3 rooms away. When Harriet refused him, again, he changed tactics. He would send her children to his son's plantation, separate them, break them as field hands before they turned 10. "You have nowhere to go," Norcom told her, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who controlled every door, every road, every possibility. "Run north and you abandon your children forever. Stay, and they suffer for your defiance. Either way you lose." He was right about one thing. Harriet couldn't run north. The route to freedom meant leaving her son Joseph and daughter Louisa Matilda behind, and she would rather die than live free while they remained in chains. So she chose the impossible third option. Her grandmother Molly Horniblow had built a small addition to her house, a porch with storage space beneath the roof. The crawl space measured 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. At its highest point, the ceiling rose 3 feet above the floor. You couldn't stand, you couldn't walk, you could barely sit upright. Harriet climbed into that coffin-sized darkness on a summer night in 1835. Norcom's house sat 1 block away, close enough that she could hear his voice calling her name during those first desperate weeks of searching. Close enough that his footsteps passed her grandmother's door 100 times. He never thought to look in the attic. The space was too small, too suffocating, too impossible for human endurance. Norcom had underestimated her before. He was about to spend 7 years learning exactly how wrong he'd been. Dr. James Norcom understood the mathematics of control. An enslaved woman with 2 young children had exactly 3 options: submit to his demands, run north and abandon her family forever, or remain and watch her children suffer the consequences of her defiance. He had eliminated the third option by threatening to send Joseph and Louisa to his son's plantation. He knew Harriet would never choose the second. That left only submission. When she vanished in June 1835, Norcom's confusion lasted approximately 12 hours before it transformed into rage. He searched his own house first, certain she must be hiding in some corner he'd overlooked. Then he moved to the neighboring properties, interrogating anyone who might have seen her. He questioned her family with barely concealed threats. He offered rewards for information. He sent notices to newspapers describing her in detail, promising money for her return. The searches intensified. Norcom believed an enslaved woman couldn't simply disappear. Someone had to be hiding her. Someone had to know where she'd gone. The Underground Railroad had routes through North Carolina, but those required planning, coordination, and contacts that Norcom was certain Harriet didn't possess. He was partially right. Harriet hadn't fled north. She'd fled upward, into a crawl space above her grandmother's porch, barely a block from where Norcom conducted his increasingly frantic searches. The first week tested whether human beings could survive in spaces designed for storage, not habitation. The attic measured 9 feet by 7 feet. The ceiling rose to 3 feet at its peak, then sloped downward toward the edges. Harriet couldn't stand. She couldn't stretch her legs fully. She could sit hunched forward or lie on her side, curled like a child. The June heat made the space an oven. Temperatures inside the crawl space climbed past 100 degrees during the afternoon. The air grew thick and suffocating. Harriet's grandmother Molly brought water after dark, climbing quietly to deliver food and remove waste. They couldn't risk visits during daylight. One neighbor's suspicion, one casual observation of unusual activity, and Norcom would discover everything. Through gaps in the wooden slats, Harriet could see fragments of the street below. She watched Norcom walk past her grandmother's house. She heard his voice calling her name during those first desperate days. He stood so close she could have reached through the boards and touched his shoulder. He never looked up. The impossibility of the hiding place protected her. Norcom couldn't imagine anyone choosing this imprisonment. 7 days in that space would break most people. 7 weeks seemed unthinkable. The idea that someone would endure this for years simply didn't enter his calculations. After 2 weeks, Norcom changed tactics. He had Harriet's brother arrested, then her aunt. Then, most painfully, he imprisoned her children, Joseph, barely 6 years old, and Louisa, even younger. He didn't harm them, he didn't need to. The message was clear: reveal yourself or watch your family suffer for your absence. Harriet stayed hidden. She could hear her children playing in the yard below. Their voices drifted up through the floorboards and the cracks in the walls. They were so close, 30 feet away, maybe less. She watched them through the peepholes she'd carefully drilled into the wood, tiny openings that gave her narrow views of the world she'd left behind. Joseph looked for her. She saw him scanning the street, his small face confused and frightened. Louisa asked where her mother had gone. Harriet heard those questions and couldn't answer. The psychological torture of proximity without contact was more painful than the physical agony of confinement. Norcom kept the children imprisoned for months. He visited her grandmother's house regularly, sometimes to make threats, sometimes simply to demonstrate his power. He stood in the rooms below Harriet's hiding place and described what would happen when he found her. He detailed the punishments awaiting anyone who had helped her escape. Molly Horniblow, Harriet's grandmother, maintained perfect composure. She was a free black woman, technically beyond Norcom's direct control, but vulnerable nonetheless. One mistake, one visible sign of deception, and Norcom would find ways to destroy her. She played the role of confused, grieving grandmother while secretly delivering food and water to the woman hiding above her head. Summer gave way to fall. Norcom's searches expanded beyond Edenton. He sent inquiries to other towns, other counties. He remained convinced that Harriet had fled, probably to the north, probably with assistance from abolitionists or free black networks. The possibility that she remained in Edenton, that she'd been there all along, watching him search, never seriously occurred to him. By winter, Harriet understood the full scope of what she'd chosen. The cold was as brutal as the summer heat had been. The crawlspace offered no insulation. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Her limbs went numb. She developed symptoms that would plague her for the rest of her life: chronic pain, reduced mobility, permanent damage from years without movement or exercise. But she could see her children. And Norcom hadn't found her. That had to be enough. The first year taught Harriet the difference between survival and endurance. Survival meant maintaining consciousness through the summer heat that transformed the crawlspace into an oven. It meant rationing the small amounts of water her grandmother could deliver after dark. It meant staying absolutely silent when Norcom's voice drifted up from the street below, sometimes so close she could distinguish individual words. Endurance meant accepting that this wasn't temporary. This was her life now. The physical deterioration began within months. Human bodies aren't designed for spaces where standing is impossible and stretching forbidden. Harriet's legs cramped constantly. Her back ached from the perpetual hunched position. She tried to exercise, small movements, careful stretches, but the 9 by 7 foot space allowed almost nothing. Lying down meant curling on her side. Sitting meant keeping her head bowed to avoid hitting the sloped ceiling. By winter, her joints had stiffened. The cold seeped through the wooden walls without mercy. There was no heat, no insulation, nothing to block the North Carolina chill that dropped temperatures below freezing. Harriet wrapped herself in whatever blankets Molly could spare, but warmth was impossible. Her fingers went numb. Her feet lost feeling for hours at a time. She rubbed circulation back into her limbs until her hands burned, then repeated the process when numbness returned. The rats came with the cold. They nested in the corners of the crawlspace, bold and numerous. Harriet could hear them moving through the darkness, their claws scratching against wood. She learned to distinguish their sounds from the creaking of the house, from footsteps on the floor below, from the wind pushing against the exterior walls. The rats didn't frighten her. They were company in their way, other living things sharing this impossible prison. Through the peephole she drilled into the wood, Harriet watched her children grow. Joseph turned 7, then 8. Louisa grew taller, her face losing its baby roundness. They played in the yard below. They ran errands through the streets. They lived entire days while their mother watched from 30 feet above, unable to call out, unable to touch them, unable to be anything except an invisible witness to their lives. The psychological torture exceeded the physical suffering. Harriet could see Joseph searching for her. His eyes scanned the crowds on market days, hoping to spot his mother's face. He asked questions. Where had she gone? When would she return? Had she abandoned them? The answers he received were deliberately vague, designed to protect the secret that kept everyone safe. But Harriet heard the confusion in his voice. She saw the hurt in his posture. Louisa was younger, her memories of their life together already fading. She adapted to her mother's absence with the resilience of early childhood, and that adaptation wounded Harriet more deeply than Joseph's searching. Her daughter was forgetting her. The woman in the attic was becoming a ghost, even to her own children. Time distorted in the crawlspace. Days blended together. Harriet marked the passage of seasons by temperature changes and the quality of light filtering through the cracks. Summer meant suffocating heat and the sound of children playing outside. Fall brought cooler air and shorter days. Winter meant darkness and cold that penetrated to the bone. Spring was rain drumming against the roof, inches from her head. Norcom's searches continued through the second year, though with diminishing intensity. He still believed Harriet had fled north. He sent letters to contacts in free states, describing her appearance and offering rewards. He questioned anyone with connections to the Underground Railroad. He investigated rumors and followed false leads. He walked past her grandmother's house almost daily and never once looked toward the roof. The confinement damaged Harriet's body in ways that would never fully heal. Her muscles atrophied from lack of use. Her spine curved from constant hunching. She developed chronic pain that no position could relieve. When she tried to move, small exercises to maintain some strength, her joints protested, her circulation deteriorated. She began losing feeling in her extremities for longer periods. By the third year, Harriet understood she might die in this space. Disease, injury, simple exposure during winter, any of these could kill her before she escaped. Her grandmother was aging. The risk of discovery never diminished. One neighbor's suspicion, one careless noise at the wrong moment, and everything would collapse. But the alternative was worse. Norcom still controlled her children's fate. If she revealed herself, if she surrendered or got caught, he would punish her by destroying them. He threatened it explicitly. Sell them to distant plantations, separate them permanently, ensure she never saw them again. The threat wasn't empty. He'd imprisoned them for months trying to force information about her whereabouts. He'd tormented her family, arrested her relatives, and made clear that her defiance would cost everyone she loved. So Harriet stayed. Through summers that reached temperatures she couldn't measure but could barely survive. Through winters that froze her limbs and made breathing painful. Through hundreds of days watching her children from holes drilled in wood, unable to hold them, unable to comfort them, unable to be their mother in any way except silently, invisibly protecting them from the distance of 30 feet. The crawlspace became her entire world, 9 feet by 7 feet, 3 feet high at the peak, shared with rats and darkness and the ghosts of everything she'd sacrificed. She measured her life in sounds now, footsteps below, voices in the street, her children's laughter, Norcom's threats, the scratching of vermin in corners she couldn't see. And through it all, she endured. By the 7th year, Harriet's body was failing. The crawlspace had taken everything it could extract without killing her outright. Her legs barely functioned anymore. When she tried to shift positions, her joints refused to cooperate. The numbness that had once been temporary now lasted for days, She'd developed a persistent cough from breathing stale air, thick with dust and mold. Her spine had curved permanently from years of hunching beneath a 3-foot ceiling, but her mind remained sharp, and her grandmother had finally received word from contacts in the north. The Maritime Underground Railroad operated along North Carolina's coast, moving people to freedom through networks of ship captains, dock workers, and sailors who risked everything to undermine the system that enslaved millions. Getting access to these networks required connections, trust, and timing. Molly Horniblow had spent years building relationships, passing messages, waiting for the right opportunity. In the spring of 1842, that opportunity arrived. A ship captain sympathetic to the cause would be docking in Edenton within weeks. He'd done this before. Hidden people in cargo holds, beneath deck planks, anywhere that might escape detection during inspections. The risk was enormous. If authorities discovered escapees on his vessel, the captain faced prison, financial ruin, or worse. But he'd agreed to help. The message reached Harriet through her grandmother. After 7 years of waiting, 7 years of watching her children grow from holes drilled in wood, 7 years of enduring heat and cold and rats and darkness, she finally had a path to freedom. The preparation required precision. Harriet's body had atrophied to the point where walking might be impossible. Her legs had spent 7 years folded in cramped positions. Her muscles had withered. When she tried to move, practicing in the crawlspace at night, her limbs trembled with weakness. She couldn't stand without support. Her balance was gone. They had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare her for a journey that would require climbing down from the attic, walking to the waterfront, boarding a vessel, and surviving days hidden in a ship's cargo hold. Any of these tasks might prove impossible for someone whose body had essentially been paralyzed for 7 years. Molly brought her granddaughter food to rebuild strength. Not too much. Sudden changes would make Harriet sick, but consistent meals designed to restore some of the muscle mass she'd lost. Harriet exercised within the 9x7 space, pushing her body beyond what seemed possible. Her legs screamed in protest, her joints ached, but she forced movement back into limbs that had forgotten how to function. The psychological preparation was harder. After 7 years in darkness, Harriet would emerge into open streets where anyone might recognize her. Norcom still lived 1 block away. His searches had diminished, but hadn't stopped entirely. If someone spotted her, if anyone connected this broken woman to the young mother who'd vanished in 1835, everything would collapse. Her children complicated the mathematics of escape. Joseph was now 13, Louisa was 11. They'd grown up believing their mother had fled north or died trying. Revealing herself meant risking their safety. If they reacted visibly, if they showed surprise or recognition at the wrong moment, observers would notice. And Norcom still watched Molly's household, still hoped that Harriet might somehow make contact. The decision was made to keep the children uninformed until the last possible moment. 2 nights before the planned escape, Molly told Harriet the ship had arrived. The captain was ready. The window for escape would be narrow, perhaps a single night when the vessel could be approached without excessive scrutiny. Harriet spent her final day in the crawlspace, saying goodbye to the prison that had protected her. She'd lived here longer than some people lived in houses they owned. This 9x7 space knew her better than any physical location in her life. She'd endured impossible suffering here. She'd watched her children grow through peepholes here. She'd broken her body here to keep her family alive. On the night of her escape, Molly brought Joseph to the storeroom below the crawlspace. For the first time in 7 years, Harriet descended from the attic. Her legs barely held her weight. The simple act of standing felt foreign and terrifying. Her head swam from the change in position, and then she saw her son. Joseph had been 6 years old when she disappeared. Now he was 13, taller, his voice deeper, his face showing the first signs of the man he'd become. He'd spent 7 years searching for a mother who'd been watching him from 30 feet above his head the entire time. They had perhaps 10 minutes together. Not enough time to explain 7 years. Not enough time to heal the wounds of separation. just enough time to hold each other and weep quietly while Molly stood guard. "I knew you were here," Joseph whispered. "I was afraid they'd catch you." Harriet couldn't speak. 7 years of silence had stolen her voice. She held her son and memorized the feeling of his arms around her because she didn't know if she'd survive the next few hours. Then Molly signaled that time was up. Peter, the young man who'd helped Harriet 7 years earlier, waited in the street. The ship captain expected her arrival within the hour. Every minute of delay increased the risk of discovery. Harriet released her son and walked toward freedom on legs that barely remembered how to function. The walk from Molly Hornablow's house to the Edenton waterfront covered less than half a mile. For Harriet, whose legs had forgotten how to carry weight, the distance might as well have been 100. Peter guided her through back streets, avoiding main thoroughfares where lamps might illuminate her face. Every step required concentration. Her muscles trembled from exertion. Her balance wavered. 7 years without walking had transformed the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other into something foreign and dangerous. They moved slowly, stopping frequently so Harriet could lean against walls and recover. The June night air felt strange against her skin after years of breathing the stale atmosphere of the crawlspace. Sounds seemed amplified. Dogs barking in distant yards, voices drifting from taverns, the creak of wagon wheels on packed dirt. Her senses, dulled by confinement, struggled to process the sudden flood of stimulation. Norcom's house appeared briefly in her peripheral vision. 1 block away. She'd spent 7 years hidden within shouting distance of the man who tormented her, and he'd never discovered her presence. The irony would have been satisfying if terror hadn't overwhelmed every other emotion. The waterfront smelled of fish and tar and salt water. Merchant vessels lined the docks, their masts rising against the night sky like skeletal fingers. Peter led Harriet toward a smaller ship, less conspicuous than the larger trading vessels. The captain waited near the gangway, his posture tense. "You're late," he said quietly, not accusatory, just stating fact. Schedules mattered when you were smuggling human beings past authorities who'd hang you for the crime. "She hasn't walked in 7 years," Peter explained. The captain's expression shifted. He'd done this before, helped people escape through the Maritime Underground Railroad, but 7 years of confinement exceeded anything he'd encountered. He studied Harriet's trembling legs, her hunched posture, the way she couldn't fully straighten her spine. "Can you climb?" he asked. The ship's cargo hold required descending a ladder. Harriet looked at the narrow rungs and understood the question's real meaning. Could her body handle what freedom demanded? "I'll manage," she said. Her voice sounded strange after years of enforced silence. The captain led her aboard. The deck shifted beneath her feet. Another sensation her body had forgotten. Balance on solid ground was difficult enough. Balance on a moving surface seemed impossible. But Harriet followed him toward the hold, gripping whatever surfaces she could reach. The ladder descended into darkness. Harriet tested the first rung with her foot. Her leg trembled violently. She forced it to hold weight, then brought her other leg down. One rung, then another. Each movement required conscious thought. Her hands ached from gripping the ladder. Her shoulders burned. Halfway down, her leg gave out completely. She slipped, catching herself on sheer instinct. The captain grabbed her from below, steadying her descent. Together they reached the bottom. The cargo hold was cramped and dark, not unlike the crawlspace she'd left behind, except this darkness was temporary. This confinement led to freedom instead of deeper imprisonment. "We depart in an hour," the captain said. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear. Inspections are rare but possible. If anyone boards, don't move, don't breathe loud. Understand?" Harriet nodded. She'd spent 7 years mastering the art of absolute silence. The captain climbed back to the deck, leaving her alone in the hold. Cargo surrounded her, barrels and crates creating a maze of hiding places. She found a corner where she could sit with her back supported, taking pressure off her damaged spine. Time passed differently on the ship. Without the familiar sounds of her grandmother's house, without the peephole showing fragments of street life, Harriet had no reference points. She counted her heartbeats. She listened to footsteps on the deck above. She waited. The ship lurched as it left the dock. The motion was gentle at first, then more pronounced as they reached open water. Harriet's stomach rebelled against the unfamiliar sensation. She'd never been on a ship before. The rhythmic rocking, pleasant to experienced sailors, felt like being trapped in a wooden box that someone kept tilting at random angles. The voyage to Philadelphia would take days, multiple days hidden in darkness, unable to move freely, seasick and terrified. After 7 years in the crawlspace, Harriet might have expected this confinement to feel familiar. Instead, it felt worse. The ship's motion was unpredictable, the sounds were alien, and beneath everything ran the constant fear that inspectors might board, might search the hold, might discover her and return her to Norcom. But there was something else too, something she hadn't felt in 7 years: hope. Every mile the ship traveled carried her farther from Edenton, farther from Norcom, farther from the legal system that defined her as property instead of human. The crawlspace had offered hiding. This journey offered transformation. On the third day, the ship's motion changed. They were entering port. Harriet heard increased activity above deck, sailors calling to each other, ropes being secured, the sounds of docking procedures. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Philadelphia, free territory, the North. The captain descended into the hold hours after they docked. "We're clear," he said. "No inspections. You're safe." Safe. The word sounded foreign. He helped her climb back to the deck. Sunlight blinded her momentarily. When her eyes adjusted, she saw a city unlike anything she'd known. Buildings stretched in every direction. People moved freely through streets. Black people walking alongside white people, no visible chains, no obvious terror in their postures. "There are people here who'll help you," the captain said, gesturing toward the dock where a black man waited. "Friends of the cause." Harriet descended the gangway on legs that barely functioned. When her feet touched Philadelphia soil, she stopped. 7 years, 2,555 days, hidden in a space measuring 9 feet by 7 feet. And now she stood in a city where the law recognized her humanity. She took a breath that felt like the first real breath of her life. Philadelphia in 1842 operated by rules Harriet didn't yet understand. Black people walked freely through streets without passes, without owners, without the constant calculation of which white faces might demand explanations. The absence of terror felt more disorienting than its presence ever had. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee connected her with abolitionists who provided temporary housing. These were people who dedicated their lives to undermining the system that had controlled Harriet's existence. They offered practical help: food, clothing, medical attention for her damaged body, and something more valuable: information about how to survive as a fugitive in free territory. Because Harriet wasn't truly free, not legally. Under the fugitive slave law, Norcom could pursue her across state lines. He could hire slave catchers to track her down and drag her back to North Carolina. Freedom in the North was conditional, temporary, revocable at any moment. The abolitionists explained this reality without softening it. They'd seen too many people recaptured to offer false comfort. But they also provided strategies. Stay vigilant. Avoid public spaces where bounty hunters congregated. Build networks of people who'd hide you if Norcom sent agents north. Within weeks, Harriet received news that transformed everything. Her daughter Louisa had been sent to New York. Samuel Sawyer, the white man who'd fathered both her children, had arranged the transfer. Harriet took a train from Philadelphia to New York. Her first time traveling openly. Her first experience of movement without hiding. The reunion with Louisa carried complicated emotions. Her daughter was now 11, nearly 12. She'd spent 7 formative years believing her mother had either fled north or died trying. The sudden reappearance of a woman she barely remembered required adjustments neither of them knew how to navigate. But they were together. After 7 years of watching through peepholes, Harriet could finally hold her daughter, could speak to her, could begin rebuilding a relationship that enslavement had shattered. In New York, Harriet found work as a nursemaid for Nathaniel Parker Willis, a well-known writer and editor. The position offered stability and relative safety. The Willis family treated her with respect, not as property, not as something less than human, but as an employee with skills and value. The psychological adjustment from Norcom's household to the Willis family required constant recalibration of expectations, but safety remained elusive. In 1843, word reached Harriet that Norcom had discovered her location. He'd hired agents to track her down, the man who'd tormented her for years, who'd imprisoned her children trying to force her surrender, who'd searched Edenton for 7 years without realizing she was 1 block away. He wasn't finished. Harriet fled to Boston, where abolitionists provided another layer of protection. The constant movement, the perpetual vigilance, the knowledge that legal freedom remained beyond her reach. These became the new parameters of her existence. Her son Joseph joined her in Boston 2 years after her escape. The reunion brought joy mixed with grief. Joseph was now 15, nearly a man. He'd spent crucial years of his childhood without his mother, watching her hiding place without knowing it, growing up under Norcom's indirect control. The scars of separation weren't visible, but they were permanent. By 1845, Harriet had moved to Rochester, New York, where her brother John, who'd also escaped, lived and worked. Rochester hosted a vibrant abolitionist community centered around Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. Harriet found herself surrounded by people who'd experienced similar trauma, who understood the peculiar psychology of living free while legally remaining property. She began attending abolitionist meetings, not as a spectator, but as someone with stories that needed telling. The movement focused heavily on the experiences of enslaved men, their physical torture, their labor exploitation, their struggles. But Harriet understood something that many abolitionists didn't yet fully grasp. Enslavement affected women differently. The sexual violence, the threat to children, the particular horror of bearing children who were legally property, these aspects remained underrepresented in abolitionist literature. Harriet started writing, not formally at first, just personal accounts, letters describing her experiences. Her education, self-taught during those 7 years in the crawlspace, gave her the tools to articulate what she'd endured, but legal freedom still eluded her. In 1852, 10 years after her escape, the threat of recapture remained real. Norcom had died, but his daughter Mary Matilda Norcom and her husband continued pursuing Harriet. They traveled to New York, hired agents, made clear they intended to reclaim their property. Cornelia Grinnell Willis, the second wife of Nathaniel Parker Willis, made a decision that finally resolved Harriet's legal status. She purchased Harriet from the Norcom family for $300, then immediately freed her. The transaction was both liberation and humiliation. Harriet had lived free for a decade. She'd rebuilt her life, raised her children, contributed to the abolitionist movement, and yet the law still defined her as property that could be bought and sold. The $300 that purchased her freedom was both a gift and a reminder that the system considered her a commodity. But the legal chains were broken. Harriet Jacobs, who'd hidden for 7 years in a crawlspace rather than submit to her tormentor, who'd endured permanent physical damage to protect her children, who'd outlasted every attempt to break her, was finally legally free. With legal freedom secured in 1852, Harriet faced a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could retreat into privacy, build a quiet existence away from the trauma she'd endured. Or she could transform her suffering into something that might prevent others from experiencing similar horrors. She chose the latter. By the mid-1850s, Harriet had begun working seriously on a written account of her experiences. The project was unprecedented. Male authors had published narratives describing the brutality of enslavement. Frederick Douglass's autobiography had become a powerful weapon in the abolitionist arsenal. but no woman had yet published a detailed account of enslavement's sexual dimensions. The writing process forced Harriet to revisit every moment she tried to forget: Norcom's harassment, the impossible choices, the 7 years in darkness, the separation from her children. She wrote in the evenings after her work with the Willis family, documenting experiences that polite society preferred to ignore. Amy Post, a white abolitionist and women's rights advocate in Rochester, encouraged Harriet's writing and helped edit the manuscript. Lydia Maria Child, a prominent abolitionist writer, agreed to write an introduction and assist with publication. These women understood what Harriet was attempting, exposing the reality that enslavement wasn't just economic exploitation or physical torture, but systematic sexual violence against women who had no legal protection. In 1861, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was published under the pseudonym Linda Brent. Harriet had changed names and some identifying details, but the core truth remained unchanged. The book described Norcom's harassment explicitly. It detailed her decision to hide for 7 years rather than submit. It explained the impossible mathematics of motherhood under enslavement, how protecting your children might mean abandoning them, how love became another weapon masters used for control. The book shocked readers. Abolitionist literature had portrayed enslaved women as victims, but rarely with this level of specificity about sexual violence. Harriet's narrative was unflinching. She described the psychological torture of watching her children through peepholes. She detailed the physical deterioration from 7 years of confinement. She made clear that enslavement destroyed families through mechanisms white society preferred not to acknowledge. But the Civil War had begun, and Harriet's book competed for attention with battles and political upheaval. Sales were modest initially. The true impact would emerge more slowly, as readers processed what she'd revealed about the gendered dimensions of enslavement. Harriet didn't wait for literary recognition. In 1862, she traveled to Washington, D.C. and Alexandria, Virginia, to work with contraband populations, formerly enslaved people who'd fled to Union lines during the war. She and her daughter Louisa opened a school, distributed supplies, and provided medical assistance to people navigating the chaos of sudden freedom without resources or support. Her reports from Alexandria, published in abolitionist newspapers, described the conditions with the same unflinching honesty that characterized her book. She advocated for the freed people's ability to build self-determined lives if given proper support. She challenged the racist assumptions that questioned whether formerly enslaved people could function as free citizens. After the war ended in 1865, Harriet and Louisa traveled to Savannah, Georgia, with the New England Freedmen's Aid Society. They planned to establish an orphanage and asylum for elderly freed people, institutions that would provide stability in a region where legal freedom hadn't eliminated racial violence. They distributed clothing, opened schools, and worked to build infrastructure for communities transitioning from enslavement to citizenship. But the backlash was immediate and brutal. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups terrorized black communities throughout the South. The violence made Harriet's planned institutions impossible to maintain safely. By 1868, she'd returned north. The money she'd raised redirected to similar causes in safer locations. Harriet spent her remaining years in relative quiet, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then Washington, D.C. She never achieved financial security. The book that had cost her so much emotional labor to produce never generated significant income. She struggled with the chronic health problems that 7 years of confinement had created. Her spine never straightened. Her joints never fully recovered. But she'd accomplished something Norcom could never have imagined. The man who'd believed she was trapped, who'd searched for her for 7 years while she hid 1 block away, who'd tried to break her through threats to her children, he died decades earlier, his name remembered only because Harriet had documented his cruelty. Harriet died on March 7, 1897, at age 84. She'd outlived her tormentor by 46 years. She'd raised her children to adulthood in freedom. She'd written a book that would eventually be recognized as one of the most important slave narratives ever published. She'd worked tirelessly for freed people's rights during and after the Civil War. The woman who spent 7 years in a space measuring 9 feet by 7 feet, who endured permanent physical damage to protect her children, who chose an impossible imprisonment over submission, she'd won every battle that mattered. Norcom had controlled her labor for years, but never her will. He'd tried to break her spirit and failed completely. A century after her death, incidents in the life of a slave girl would be taught in universities, cited by historians, recognized as essential testimony about enslavement's gendered violence. Scholars would study her strategy, her resistance, her refusal to accept the limited options her society offered. But perhaps the truest measure of Harriet's victory was simpler. She lived free, she'd raised her children in freedom, and she made certain the world would know exactly what she'd endured and overcome to achieve it.